Officer Michael Walker had been patrolling the streets of suburban Springfield for more years than he cared to count. The town was quiet, predictable. Walker had seen it all, or so he thought. With a reputation for quick decisions and an unyielding, icy demeanor, he'd earned the respect of his peers, but also the fear of the town's residents. He was the kind of cop who didn't let his instincts go unchecked, especially when it came to drivers who didn't fit the mold of the usual commuter. As a veteran officer, he had a habit of sizing people up the moment they passed him. It was second nature, years of experience ingrained in him like a muscle memory. He prided himself on being able to spot suspicious drivers based on the smallest of details: how they drove, how they looked, the time of night. It was almost like a game, one he played with a relentless sense of authority. That night, however, the game was about to take an unexpected turn. Walker was parked along a stretch of road, his patrol car hidden in the shadows, when a sleek black SUV cruised past him. The sound of its engine was almost silent, the kind of smooth hum that made Walker's suspicions flare. He barely caught a glimpse of the driver, just enough to note that it was a woman and not someone who seemed to belong in the neighborhood. She wore sunglasses despite the late hour, an oddity that immediately piqued his curiosity. What's she doing driving around here at this hour? He thought, narrowing his eyes. He had an instinct, honed by years of experience, telling him something wasn't right. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and before he could even second-guess it, he flicked on the sirens, pulling the SUV over. Inside the SUV, Special Agent Emma Bennett sighed, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. She'd been lost in thought, absorbed in the intricacies of her latest investigation, a high-profile case involving a local extremist group that had been gaining traction in Springfield. Emma was used to danger. She was used to navigating tense situations and working under pressure. But being pulled over by a local officer who had no idea who she was? This was a frustration she knew far too well. Emma had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the biases that permeated the system, particularly in small towns like Springfield. She had faced these kinds of unnecessary stops more times than she cared to remember. This officer, she could already tell, wasn't going to make this easy. As she sat still in her seat, she felt her body tense. The sudden awareness that her evening was about to take an unexpected turn. She watched in her rearview mirror as Officer Walker swaggered toward her car, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun, a flashlight in the other. License and registration. He barked, the authority in his voice unmistakable. Emma remained calm, her eyes flicking momentarily to the dashboard where her credentials were displayed. With a measured motion, she handed them over, her gaze steady. She could sense the officer's judgment forming the instant he saw her credentials. His eyes flickered to the FBI logo, and his mouth twisted into a sneer. FBI? Walker chuckled under his breath. I've seen fake badges before. Emma's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with a deep, simmering irritation. She knew what this was. It was a power move, pure and simple. The fact that he's questioning me right now is ridiculous. She exhaled slowly, keeping her voice neutral. I'm Special Agent Emma Bennett. I'm working a classified investigation with the FBI. Walker didn't care. His mind was made up the moment he saw her. This woman didn't belong. She was out of place, or at least that's what he wanted to believe. He took a step closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. Step out of the vehicle, he ordered, his tone sharp, a clear indication of his rising authority. Emma blinked, processing his demand. Was he serious? Did this officer just ask her, an FBI agent, to step out of her car? She remained motionless for a moment, her breath steady. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was absurd. I said, step out of the vehicle, Walker repeated, his voice growing louder, more insistent. Emma unbuckled her seatbelt slowly, the wheels in her mind turning. She could see where this was going. It wasn't just about protocol now. This was about pride and power, and Officer Walker was more interested in asserting his dominance than he was in respecting the law. With a single, controlled motion, she opened the door, stepping out of the vehicle. Officer, I don't think you understand, Emma began, but she was cut off before she could finish. Step away from the car, Walker barked, his hand reaching for his cuffs. I'll figure out what your real story is back at the station. Emma's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained calm, almost cold. Do you have any idea who I am? Walker scoffed, dismissing her words with a shake of his head. Yeah, I know who you are, he muttered under his breath. Another one of those thinking they can walk all over the law. His eyes locked onto hers, attempting to assert control over the situation. But Emma wasn't backing down. She stood her ground, her posture radiating authority, her gaze unwavering. Walker leaned in closer, trying to intimidate her. You think that badge makes you untouchable? He sneered. In that moment, Emma's calm exterior cracked slightly, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. Officer Walker, she said, her voice like steel. I'm Special Agent Emma Bennett. I'm working a federal investigation. You're obstructing a federal agent in the middle of a classified operation. For a split second, Walker faltered. He looked at her as if he was finally starting to process the weight of the situation. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He stepped closer, raising his voice. Turn around, hands behind your back. Emma's patience snapped. In one fluid motion, she spun around, grabbing his wrist before he could lay a hand on her. Her movements were swift and precise, her grip unyielding as she twisted his arm behind his back. Walker gasped, his breath catching in his throat as pain shot up his arm. In an instant, he found himself pressed up against the side of her SUV, his body caught off guard by the force of her movements. His mind raced, trying to comprehend how quickly the tables had turned. You have no idea what you've just done, Emma hissed in his ear, her grip tightening just enough to make him freeze in place. She released him, stepping back. Walker stumbled away, his eyes wide, his mind struggling to catch up. He had underestimated her in every possible way. The officer who thought he had control of the situation now found himself humiliated, his authority shattered in a matter of seconds. You should consider yourself lucky, Emma said coolly. I could arrest you for obstruction right now, but I'm going to let you walk away from this. For now. Her words hung in the air, heavy with a kind of finality that left Walker speechless. He stood there, his hands trembling, his pride in tatters as he watched her return to her vehicle. Before he could react, she was gone, the sound of her SUV's engine fading into the night. The silence that followed was deafening. Later that night, Walker returned to the police station, his thoughts still spinning from the encounter. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone horribly wrong. He had no idea what he had just done. As he walked into the station, he was greeted by Captain Robert, who was waiting for him with an expression that could only be described as cold. Walker, Robert said, his voice sharp. We need to talk. Walker's stomach dropped. He could already feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. Captain, he began, but Robert cut him off with a wave of his hand. Save it, Robert said, his voice laced with disappointment. We just got off the phone with the FBI. You have any idea who you pulled over tonight? Walker's face went pale as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had heard the rumors about a federal investigation in town, but he never imagined that the woman he had accosted would be involved. He had never imagined that the woman he had harassed was the very person who held the power to bring his career to an end. You're suspended, Robert said bluntly, his words final. Pending an investigation. Pack your things. Walker stood frozen, the weight of his actions slowly sinking in. In that moment, he understood the consequences of his prejudices. His quick judgments, his biases, had led him to make a decision that had cost him everything. Meanwhile, Emma was back in her office at the FBI, filing her report. A faint smile tugged at her lips. Justice had a funny way of working itself out, especially when the person on the wrong side of the law was wearing a badge. As she finished typing, she leaned back in her chair, her thoughts momentarily drifting. She knew the work she did wasn't always glamorous, but it was always important. Tonight had been a reminder that no one was above the law, not even the ones who wore badges to enforce it.